If you were to ask me what are the genres of photography and video that I really enjoy but almost never do, it would be sports, wildlife, and telephoto landscape. And when I'm traveling with my family, which I do quite often, I regularly have opportunities to engage in this type of image making. But the lenses I have really aren't travel friendly, and for best results, I often need a tripod. And this new lens eliminates all those issues for me because it's small, lightweight, and has best-in-class image stabilization. And it's actually more affordable than the other super telephoto lenses I own. I was able to take this new lens on a recent trip, and it produced my best wildlife photos and videos ever. I was also able to capture some pretty cool landscape shots, including some really long exposures, which gave me great results in low light conditions, but it also allowed me to get some really cool handheld long exposure or shutter drag shots. As most people know, when it comes to my camera usage, I'm pretty well brand agnostic. I use Sony, Canon, Nikon, Fuji, Lumix, and Leica. I mainly do this so I can share my experience with all these different brands for people that watch the channel and might need some help deciding which camera brand might be best for them. But this always leaves me in a bit of a situation, particularly when I'm traveling, when I have to decide which camera brand or lens mount I'm going to bring on my trip. And this new lens is going to make that decision quite easy because it's really the only travel-friendly super telephoto lens that I own, and it's quite possibly the most travel-friendly super telephoto lens ever made. This lens is not only smaller and lighter than my previous lens options, it's also less expensive. Now, I'll put some links in the description down below to the best pricing I could find on the lens. And in full disclosure, Lumix did send me the Lumix S 100 to 500mm lens at no cost to myself, but I've not been paid by Lumix, and I'm not under any obligation to even make a video. So these are my true and genuine thoughts, but the photos and video samples should really speak for themselves. Now, there's a range of different focal lengths you can get from these super telephoto lenses, but this is the smallest and lightest super telephoto lens that I could find with a 5x zoom range. I couldn't find anything else that was really even close. And because of that, for travel, this means that in my standard camera bag that I bring with me, which is actually not one of the big roller bags, I stopped bringing those with me because I found that often I would go to get on the plane and they would decide it was checked bags only and my camera gear would end up going underneath the plane. I actually carry a camera bag that will go under the seat, even though I generally get it in the overhead locker. It's one that technically can go under the seat, so they never take that away from me. And with the new lens, I can carry a super telephoto lens in that bag, so I can get 2 camera bodies, 3 zoom lenses, and 2 prime lenses, plus batteries, chargers, filters, and my power brick for my MacBook and everything else I need. That was never possible in the past unless I went and was shooting APS-C cameras. One of the headline features of the lens is the incredible image stabilization it has, particularly when you combine it with a body that has in-body image stabilization. This is going to give you incredibly smooth handheld video at 500mm. Plus, it's going to allow you to do long exposure photo, which is going to be great for low light, but it's also going to allow you to create shutter drag images and those ethereal seascape images by doing a long shutter speed. It also has the ability to control the image stabilization with a switch on the lens. So when you're panning and you don't want the image to be jumping as you're panning, you just switch to image stabilization mode 2. And even when I was shooting this lens and I could see and feel my hands shaking, or I could feel the wind moving me being blasted in these windy conditions that I was shooting in, the video was still incredibly stable. And without question, this is the best image stabilization in any system that I've ever used, particularly at these longer focal lengths. Another kind of crazy magic trick this lens has is this close-up image quality or maximum magnification. When you're shooting at 100mm, you're going to get an 80cm minimum focus distance, which is a 0.16x magnification. But when you go to 500mm, you're going to get a 1.5 meter minimum focus distance, which is going to give you a 0.36x magnification. This is borderline macro lenses. Now, depending on who you talk to, some people think 1:1 is macro, some people think 0.5:1 is macro. This is definitely giving you macro looking images. But the thing that's interesting about it, particularly at 500mm, you're getting this incredible compression that you've probably never seen out of a macro lens before. And a lot of the photos I was taking with this lens just almost look completely otherworldly, whether it was insects or flowers. And you could do handheld video at 500mm in this kind of pseudo macro of insects flying and moving, which was really quite incredible. So this is definitely a style of image that I haven't got out of any other lens that I own. Looking at the overall image quality you're going to get out of the lens, and keep in mind, these are real world images that I'm using. I've turned in-camera corrections on, and I've let Lightroom correct the images as they came in. This is not going to be a clinical review. This is going to be what you get when you go out and shoot the lens. This is what you're going to see. Now, to start with, the lens is much sharper than my Sony 200 to 600, comparing the real world images. So I was very impressed by the sharpness. I was also impressed that from 100 to 500, there were no weak points. I didn't feel like I was shooting at one focal length and then later had an image at another focal length and said, I could see I'm losing resolution as I'm zooming in or as I'm zooming out. Definitely in the real world images, all of them are very, very sharp. This isn't a test chart, but in real world images, they're all going to be as sharp as each other. The lens exhibits very little vignette, so it's clean all the way to the corners. This is great for those landscape photos when you're stopping down to f9, f10, f11. And the lens exhibited no standard chromatic aberration I could find, that is purple fringing or color fringing around the in-focus high contrast scenes. I even shot some scenes where I have a black sign with a almost pure white or blue sky behind it, and there was absolutely nothing. I did find in some of the shots I did of the animals in the trees that were heavily backlit, I would get some minor longitudinal chromatic aberration in a few different shots. I didn't think it spoiled the image or had any major impact, but if I went looking for it, I would find a little bit of that here and there, but it was exceptionally well controlled. The flare was well controlled. Even when I was shooting it directly at a street light zoomed into 500 millimeters, you got a blooming around that bright point of light, but the rest of the image held its contrast really well. And looking at the bokeh and out of focus areas, the bokeh balls were mostly round throughout the frame. It does have an 11 bladed aperture, I think it is, which is going to help that. What I did find is in most situations, you got a smooth and pleasing out of focus area, which just formed a nice backdrop for whatever is sharp and detailed in the frame. But in some situations, particularly where you had grasslands or reeds or a complicated background, sometimes the background would get a little bit busy, but this is only in a minor number of my images. The lens being a 100 to 500 zoom range means you've got a 5 times optical zoom range. I think this is kind of a sweet spot for this sort of sports, wildlife, and landscape photography. The only lens that has a bigger zoom range is the Sigma 60 to 600, which I've always considered buying, but I never did because the size and weight of that lens. And after that, the equal best in class would be Canon's 100 to 500, but that lens is a little bit bigger and it's also about a third more expensive, or about $1,000 more. The other thing to keep in mind with this lens is it is compatible with the teleconverter. So Lumix makes a 1.4 times teleconverter and a 2 times teleconverter. That's going to get you to 700 or 1000 millimeters at the sacrifice of a few stops of light. The other thing to keep in mind is a lot of Lumix's new cameras have the hybrid zoom or crop zoom function. That is going to allow you to get a tighter framing or an effective digital version of a longer focal length by engaging that. And then the S12E that I was using, I was getting an effective 781 millimeter focal length in video without seeing any loss in resolution or detail. The other thing is you can combine the hybrid zoom and crop zoom with the teleconverters, and depending on which camera you're using, you can get an effective focal length up to 3,125 millimeters. And if you aren't familiar with the crop zoom or hybrid zoom function, I will put a link in the description down below. Sean from Lumix did a really good overview of how that works. So if you use Lumix and you don't know about the hybrid zoom, check that out. But if you're thinking about getting into Lumix system, that is a super powerful function that the Lumix cameras have that most other brands don't. The build quality of the lens is very similar to Lumix other S-series lenses. It is a composite body lens, but it doesn't feel cheap by any means. It has a very smooth and well-dampened focus ring, and the focus ring is also customizable. So when you're in autofocus mode, you can change this to a control ring to control different functions on the camera. One of the other cool new features on this lens is the tight or smooth zoom adjustment. And what this does is this controls how stiff it is to zoom in and out. Now, interestingly, I thought if you went into the smooth, it would probably be super loose and floppy, and the tight would be super tight and hard to turn, and you would probably have to pick somewhere in between. But that's actually not the case. The difference between the smooth and the tight is quite subtle, with the biggest difference that I found is when it is in the tight mode, you're less likely to bump that zoom or zoom in and out when you don't want to. It also makes it so you're not getting any lens creep when you're walking and hanging the lens at your side, where with smooth is just a little bit smoother, and it works quite well for video when you want to zoom in and out while actually shooting video. But also if you're swinging around trying to catch wildlife and you want to be extra quick, then you would just put it in the smooth function. But once again, the entire range is very usable and the difference is reasonably subtle. It also has a programmable button, so you can make that your focus hold, or you can make that go into crop zoom or whatever, and that's programmable in the camera. You also have a series of switches. So you have a focus distance limiter. So if you're shooting something in the distance and you don't need it to go through that first 5 meters, maybe birds in flight or some kangaroos way off in the distance, you just go down to the 5 meter to infinity, and that is going to stop it from going through the full range. You've got your autofocus manual focus switch, which I really like, particularly for landscape. So you set up your scene, you get your focus, you switch it into manual focus, and then it's not going to change on you. Then you have the image stabilization switch. This is going to give you mode 1, which is normal stabilization. You're just holding the camera steady. You've got an animal or something off in the distance that you're just trying to hold in frame. If you click it into mode 2, that is going to be for panning. Maybe you're following cars or birds in flight or something like that. And then you click it all the way down, and that is going to turn off the image stabilization for when you're doing something on a tripod. The other switch you're going to find on the other side here, this is the zoom limit. Now, when you turn the zoom limit on, what you'll find is when you zoom out, it'll click, and then that will not allow the lens to zoom back in past 150 millimeters. And this may seem like a strange one, but it's there for a very specific reason. It's because when you use the teleconverters, the lens can't zoom in past that 150 millimeter mark. Now, interestingly, my first thought was, well, what if you leave the teleconverter on and you don't turn that switch on and you zoom back to 100 millimeters? Actually, the elements in the lens are designed to just slide up if you zoom it all the way in, and that way you won't damage any of the elements, but it won't be functional in that mode. The teleconverter and the lens won't work together when it is zoomed all the way in. So with this little switch, you put the teleconverter on. Now you've got a zoom lens that starts at the 150 millimeters plus whatever your teleconverter is, and you don't have to worry about going outside of that zoom range or being in a range that's not functional. The other thing the lens comes with is a removable tripod collar, which I really like because the image stabilization is so good. Most of the time, I really don't need a tripod, so I don't want that in the way when I'm not using it on a tripod. But when you do use it on a tripod, it has an Arca Swiss plate built in, as well as a 1/4-inch screw mount. The other thing is when you put it on your camera, it's just going to allow everything to balance a little bit better, so it's a little bit less stress on the tripod. So it is nice to have if you do need to use it on a tripod. Now, would I advise someone to buy into this camera system or switch systems just to have the ability to use this lens? And that is a difficult question to answer, and switching systems is kind of a big deal. But if you're somebody upgrading from APS-C, or if you're already a full-frame user that's been attracted to the video features of the Lumix cameras already, this lens very well could be that last piece of the puzzle that just gets you over the line. In addition to that, if you purely look at the value proposition, you can buy this lens and a Lumix S5 II when it's on sale for only a little bit more than the closest comparable lens out there, which is the Canon 100-500, which just shows you how much you get for your money when you buy into Lumix. I think if you're already an L-mount user and you're interested in sports, wildlife, landscape, or even ultra telephoto macro, this lens has a small form factor, affordable price, superb image quality, and class-leading image stabilization. This makes it a very compelling option if you want to open up your world to a whole new kind of image creation.